So let's look at beef specifically. And this is not to say I have opinions about pork and chicken, trust me, but we're going to focus specifically on beef today because it's the one that really gets a lot of flack in the press. All right. And we just don't consume much lamb or goat in the US, so it doesn't merit as much attention in my opinion. So worldwide, cattle production makes up about 9.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. That's in the worldwide picture. But in the US, beef, dairy is a very small fraction of anything. Beef only makes up 3.3% of US emissions. Why is there a threefold difference between them? Because we are so much more efficient at producing dairy or beef in this country. We have our systems dialed in, whether it's grain-fed or grass-fed, we are just highly efficient. We have high quality genetics. We've really focused on breeding our animals to be highly productive. We have a climate that works really well for raising cattle. There are places that don't do as well for raising cattle. So we have a highly efficient systems that are actually very that really don't take a lot of resources to create dairy or beef as compared to the rest of the world. All right, let's talk about methane. All right, because we hear a lot about methane and how bad it is and how cows are responsible for global warming because of methane. Methane is really, really vital, okay? For one, it's not farts, it's burps, okay? I just want to clear that up because you hear a lot, people get all up in arms about AOC wants to outlaw cows because they fart, okay? For one, AOC doesn't want to outlaw cows, and for two, cows don't really, they fart a little, but they mostly burp, and the methane comes from the burps and the manure, all right? That's where it's happening. Because they have a fermentation chamber in the rumen, which is the largest chamber of their stomach, is a giant fermentation vat. Fermentation gives off gases and that gas that we care about in this case is methane. Now, it is true that methane is a more potent, meaning has higher warming value than CO2. This is true. This, for the existence of our planet, has in the long term been a very good thing because we relied on methane a lot of times. That methane from megafauna and from ruminants helped keep the planet warm. That methane was up there and keeping us warm. If you think about, we had 30 to 60 million bison in the United States, and their methane output would be similar to 30 to 60 million cattle. Okay, we have more cattle than that now. We'll look at that, but in general, it's methane, at least for the U.S. context, and methane in general, in terms of ruminants producing methane, is nothing new in terms of evolution. Ruminants have always been producing methane for thousands, millions of years. Now, so let's talk about how methane works. So you look at the biogenic carbon cycle. This is from UC Davis. And so a cow eats grass. She belches out manure. She belches out methane. She poops out manure, and that releases some methane. And it goes up into the atmosphere, and it has a higher warming potential. However, it only stays up there for 10 to 30 years. And then it comes back down. And it is methane, it comes back down as CO2, which then gets used into the plants as photosynthesis, or then sequestered based on soil health, soil principles. And it's a cycle, okay? So absent other methane emissions, other fossil fuels, methane is a balanced equation in terms of cattle. If cattle numbers remain stable for more than 25 years, okay? The estimates are 10 to 30, but we'll say 25. If cattle numbers remain stable for more than 25 years, after that 25-year period, you're not really putting any new methane up into the atmosphere because what was put up there from year one is now coming back down. So as long as our cattle numbers stay stable, we're okay. Worldwide ruminant populations have increased since 1961. I will say that. A lot of it is in India, where they don't kill cattle due to religious reasons. And then a lot of it is people developing nations having more desire for beef. As we increase efficiency, we can help with that number. And I don't mean to do it in a white saviory way. I mean, let's help give them the tools to increase the quality of their genetics and their feeding practices. US cattle numbers are down. Okay, we peaked at cattle numbers in the 70s. In 1961 for today is pretty similar, but we are producing way more beef and way more milk with way fewer cattle than we used to. So US cattle are really not a source of new methane contributing to climate change at this point. Now, looking at grain-fed and grass-fed, because that gets talked about a lot. So once we've addressed methane, we say, okay, well, that's not necessarily the huge red flag. What about grain-fed versus grass-fed? I will say, again, as I showed that US cattle are far more efficient than cattle from other countries, the differences are small. However, grass-fed does produce more methane because cattle live longer and they eat more grass. All cattle in America eat grass for the largest portion of their lives, okay? With the exception of the dairy industry. The dairy industry is a little different, but that's a small number of cattle. The vast majority of cattle in America live on grass. All the cows, they live on grass. They are having their babies on grass. Their job is just to create a baby on pasture every year, okay? And then the animals that become beef, even if they're grain finished, they're born on pasture. They're on pasture until the last few months of their lives. So all cattle in America are on grass for the majority of their lives. The finishing period, which is what we consider the last few months in which they're putting on those last couple 100 pounds in order to be ready for slaughter, the finishing period is where the difference is. Some get finished on grass, some get finished on grain. Grass-fed, they produce more methane because it takes longer to finish them and they consume more grass. And grass is what goes into the fermentation vat that produces the methane. Grain finished produce more CO2 due to more fossil fuel use and more resource use in terms of growing grain, more fertilizer use, that kind of thing. So on a per kilo live weight basis, grain finished cattle, if we do not account for carbon sequestration, do produce less carbon or CO2 equivalents, so greenhouse gas, because they do include methane. They just give it a higher factor so that's why the grass finish number is higher, because they've included methane, which cranks up the number because of its warming potential. So grass finished, however, if you account for carbon sequestration, which is the act of cattle being able to, through manure and proper grazing and everything, and we're going to look at that in a minute, grass finish does have a lower amount of emissions if you account for carbon sequestration. So this looks great, right? American grass finished cattle, let's do it. It's what I do, so I'm a fan. But so can grazing solve climate change? Because that's also what you hear. So it seems like there's this huge dichotomy, and I am not a fan of dichotomies. I'm a fan of nuance. My students will tell you nuance is my favorite word. And so you know, you hear people say, well, cattle are the reason for climate change, and if we all became vegans, it would be fine. And then you see other people saying, we can save the world with grazing cattle. Grazing cattle can solve climate change. No, neither of those. Neither of those. So can grazing solve climate change through carbon sequestration? No, but it can help. It can do a little bit, all right? Because when we tilled up the prairies, we released immense amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. The huge climate change crime of agriculture was the destruction of the plains. And these beautiful soils that you have down in Madison, I'm just north of them, my soil's not great. But these beautiful prairie soils that extend from Madison through Iowa and the plains, tilling them up just put so much carbon into the atmosphere originally. And they are just shadows of what greatness and beauty they once were. Grazing can help reverse that. Grazing is the #1 tool to reverse that climate crime, you could say, because it is very low input. You really don't need nitrogen. You need sunlight and cows and water. You don't need hardly anything else. So this is a brand new paper. This graph you're looking at right now is a brand new paper, hot off the presses. You should consider yourselves privileged to see it because almost no one's seen it yet. So this is a brand new paper I think it's probably the highest quality study ever done on grazing systems. It was the team that worked on this was just all rock stars. I was blown away when I saw the quality of this paper. So what they did is they compared side by side 5 different spots in the Southeast from Kentucky to Mississippi. And they had side by side farms that had the same soils doing what's called continuous grazing versus intensive managed grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So continuous grazing is you have a big field, you let the cows go out there, they do their thing, and you just kind of leave them there. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing, intensive managed grazing, mob grazing, high intensity rotational grazing, all of those things I do, that is what's considered the good stuff. All right. Continuous grazing is easy. Multi-paddock grazing is harder, but it's really, really beneficial. So what this showed is that on the adaptive multi-paddock grazing farms, there was about 13% more soil carbon on the adaptive multi-paddock grazed farms as compared to the continuous grazed farms. And this was across the board, no matter which farms had been grazed longer or shorter, soil type, everything. There was more soil carbon, more carbon being put back down into the soil, and in a stable fraction that wasn't going to go back up into the atmosphere after a short time, there was more carbon in the soil on your adaptive multi-paddock grazing farms. And there was also more nitrogen in the soil without adding nitrogen fertilizer on your adaptive multi-paddock grazing farms. That's huge. It's showing that we really can put carbon, not a ton, but we can put carbon back into the soil with grazing. So, is carbon the only reason to care about grazing? No. Okay. Grazing is just an all-around rock star for ecology. All right. This is a picture from my farm. I have a beautiful ridge that looks over a valley. Is just so gorgeous. So what can grazing do? Grazing keeps soil covered and can prevent erosion. You'll see that this is a slope. If I had tilled up, this is a slope that's considered highly erodible. We have very sandy soils that are very erodible. If we were to till this up and put corn in it and we got a big rainstorm in between when the corn had come up and when we had planted, we'd have huge washouts. You get a big rainstorm in the spring, there's no soil leaving my farm. We protect waterways this way. We protect groundwater this way because we're not putting sediments, fertilizers, pesticides into the water. The soil that's on my farm stays on my farm and gets better. We can reduce the use of pesticides and fertilizers because you don't need hardly any. Some people choose to use them. And then you also increase biodiversity and wildlife habitat. You see there's a large number of species in my pasture in terms of plants. We have so many birds, so many bugs, snakes, all sorts of things. And then also increasing water holding capacity. So that carbon that I showed you that managed grazing lands have, that carbon is a water sponge. That's what keeps our soils resistant to drought. So the more carbon you have in your soils, the more resistant to drought you are as well. Which with climate change, we're gonna have to worry about that. And so rather than putting, I'm at the edge of the Central Sands. A lot of my neighbors have put in pivot irrigation and they're draining our groundwater. I'm choosing to make my soils more resilient instead. All right. Lately, in the new administration, there has been a lot of talk about working with farmers to put more carbon in the soil and possibly reward farmers for adopting these practices by paying them. That sounds great, right? No, I'm not a fan. All right, so here's the point where we're moving into my opinions, okay? We're getting to the end. So I do not believe that carbon credits are an answer, all right? Farmers already have a ton of financial incentives to adopt best management practices for soil health, okay? This comes from your soils are gonna get better and healthier and you're gonna get a better crop. To the government already will pay you to do it. So if we then, the farmers just choose not to enroll in programs that would pay them to do better practices. So there's already financial incentive for them to do so from the government, and now we want to pay them again to do it. There's also no good measurement. It's very, very difficult to get good measurements of soil carbon, and so we could be paying farmers for not actually sequestering any carbon. So I'm not a fan of this policy. I'm a huge policy wonk. I am the vice president of the Green Lake County Farm Bureau. And as much as I'm a huge advocate for agriculture, I do not always have the most popular opinions among my fellow farmers. And so I do not think that this is the right answer. Farmers are already one of the most privileged groups of America. They own land. They have so much wealth in land that they hardly pay taxes on. And they get subsidies for growing corn, which, I mean, corn is great, but it's not, a lot of it gets turned into ethanol, which we don't really need. So, not a huge fan of that either. I am to the point where I have tried, my husband actually spent like 2 years just traipsing around our county, trying to convince farmers to adopt better practices. They didn't do it. It's funny. He was literally saying, "I will sign you up. I will do all the paperwork. I will make you. It will cost you virtually nothing. You're going to get paid to do these conservation practices." And they didn't do it. I am to the point where I really believe that carrots don't work. We're going to need sticks. And so I honestly would advocate for land that's in CRP, meaning farmers are getting paid to just let it sit, which some land should not be farmed, so that's fine. However, a lot of that land is stolen. Well, most of it's stolen. A lot of it's or land that gets poorly managed or is owned by the state and maybe has some weird grazing rights thing on it. You know, we never got those 40 acres and a mule to the freed peoples, and the tribes do not have access to a lot of their lands. So I would not be opposed to, if you don't take care of it the right way, you know, you don't get to keep your kids if you abuse them. you're going to abuse your land, maybe you shouldn't get to keep that either. Maybe that sounds extreme, but I've thought about this for a long, long time, and that's where I've ended up. So where do we go from here? I've given you a lot to think about. I've given you some science. I've given you some opinions. So in terms of action, what can we do to be better stewards, even if you are not someone who personally has a tract of your own? Well, as an American, driving less or using low emissions vehicles is the largest step we can take in terms of our personal emissions. And then in terms of eating meat, buying American or Canadian meat, either grain finished or grass finished, because of the lower emissions footprint that our meat does have, specifically in terms of beef. And then buying local and grass-fed from those you can, when you can, from those who you know are practicing managed grazing. And then finally, two little more personal things, supporting farmers with a justice mission, because I will say that some of the opinions expressed here today are not necessarily, they are my own. I'm a school teacher, so I have to say that they're not the schools by any means. But you know, there are a lot of farmers out there who who don't believe necessarily that Black Lives Matter, and you know, that would not necessarily be on board with some of the things that I've talked about today. And I do think that that is important if we're going to create a more just food future. And then finally, if you're looking for a movie about food and people that will fill your soul, watch Gather. It is a film about reviving, healing Indigenous people through their foodways. And it is the whole movie's a prayer. It is just incredible. So it's an indie, so you do have to pay for it. It's on Amazon. I think it's like $10, but it is so worth it. It's such a beautiful film, and it talks about lots of different things about foodways specific, and then 4 different Indigenous groups. And so if there's a movie about food that I think everyone should watch, it's Gather. So that is it. I think, okay, I talked fast, so I was not timing myself, but thank you so much for listening to me. I hope that I gave you some things to think about. Does anyone, my contact info is there. I'm at the Westside Community Market every Saturday, and there's my website, my Twitter, and I do, I also have started publishing. I'm writing a curriculum for ag educators that works to present a less whitewashed and colonized view of agriculture in America to help create a more just agricultural landscape. So I publish on Medium as well. So that is that. Does anyone have any? I'm going to stop sharing now so I can actually see you guys, if that's all right. Yeah? Okay. So yeah.
So Natasha, just a dumb question perhaps, but and I realize there is no dumb question, but you could have an ignorant one. So allow me to ask that one instead. What about water quality and runoff from livestock?
Well, in a grazing system that's properly managed, you will have virtually none. But it is a huge, huge issue. And specifically with our with CAFOs, you may have heard of CAFOs, the large feedlots. Honestly, the largest offender in that situation is going to be hog operations. I talk on Twitter to some professors in Iowa that are focused on water quality. And Bethany and Ike, you got to get your people, because the hog operations are just kind of running rampant over everything in Iowa right now, and it's really sad to watch. So large farms are absolutely, and some small farms, because some small farms don't set their farms up right at all. But if a farm that's in a managed grazing setup, more likely than not is not going to be contributing to runoff in any way, because that's the whole point of grazing, is that we keep a living root in the soil at all times. We keep our soil on our farms. We keep our manure on our farms, so that we are improving the water, not hurting the water.
Okay.
Where does the fast food industry get the beef for their hamburgers?
Good question. McDonald's largely gets theirs from retired dairy cows, unless it has the Angus label. So the Angus label means it does have to come from a cow that's mostly black. And so unless they've crossed in some Angus genetics onto a dairy, which they do specifically for McDonald's sometimes, or for Quick Trip or whatever. But McDonald's uses retired dairy cows, which there are a lot of in the United States, because you may be surprised to learn this, but the average dairy cow in the United States does not see her 5th birthday. We're averaging about 2 lactations. That's 2 births, 2 milking periods, before they consider her to be too used up to be helpful and it's also because the genetics in dairy systems are advancing so quickly that if you have a better heifer in the pipeline, it's not economical to hold on to her. I think that's kind of sad, because my favorite cow is 15 years old, and on a beef situation, you hold on to your girls as long as you can, but the dairy industry is a whole different place. If we're looking at like Culver's, a lot of their beef is coming from the packing plants in Green Bay and Minnesota. And that is a lot of Holstein steers that have been raised in feedlots. Because I will say the Holstein industry in Wisconsin is a really unique little bird. And so we have some of the least grass exposed cattle in the United States because of the dairy industry. But otherwise, the Angus beef is coming from cow calf operations and feedlots in Wisconsin and the Midwest, that are where the cows and calves are on pasture and then get put into feedlots when they're for the finishing period. So I do not really have ethical foibles with beef from the from fast food. That doesn't bother me all that much. Yeah.
I believe Ted has his hand up. Ted or Ann, is that?
Okay, my question is this. I think I heard you say buy grain-fed or grass-fed beef. So I'm wondering why. I mean, my understanding is that grass-fed is preferable, strongly preferable from an ecological standpoint. So why not just say buy grass-fed?
Okay. If you're buying grass-fed from what you know is an American or Canadian source, absolutely grass-fed. 85% of the grass-fed beef in America is imported. Most of the grass-fed beef that you will find in a grocery store was raised in Australia, South Africa, or Brazil. And those systems are far less efficient, and in fact are far less efficient, huge methane emitters in that way, because they take way longer. Those are not climates that are well suited to cattle, but they're doing it anyways. And so if you're gonna buy grass-fed, buy it from somewhere where you know where it was raised. So I do not advocate for going to the grocery store and buying anything that has a grass-fed label on it. If you're gonna buy from the grocery store, unless it's a branded program that you know was raised in the US or Canada, I would say opt for the grain fed. There's Botswana, and then but there are large herds in South Africa as well. Yes, thank you.
Well, can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Sure.
Well, not exactly follow-up, but why not? Would you recommend that people generally eat less beef for purposes of health and ecology? But in general, isn't it better to eat less beef?
Of course.
I don't personally feel that way. I know that so full disclosure, I was vegan for a while. I was vegetarian for a while. My body did not thrive with that diet. And so different people thrive with different things. And my body enjoys beef. And I also, and it has different health impacts for different people. And it is not a one-to-one equation of if we eat less beef, then then acreage is going to get turned into something else. That's not how it works. Unfortunately, the corn growers are an extremely powerful lobby. They're going to grow corn no matter what, okay, until the government tells them that they can't. And they've managed to convince, 40% of the corn crop gets turned into ethanol because the corn crop needed somewhere to go. It subsidizes the corn industry. And so we're not going to be taking acreage out of corn production because we're eating less beef. That's
probably true.
Yeah, so it's there was a study done that it was a good study. I don't have it in front of me today, but there was a really good study done a few years ago that if the entire world became vegan, our carbon footprint would reduce by about 2.5%. And that's full on vegan, because we're still going to have to get our calories elsewhere, and our our proteins, and producing rice, very high emitter of methane. And growing lentils has its own challenges. And so it's not a one-to-one ratio. You can't just grow, again, it's a land use thing. You can't just grow vegetables on the same ground that most of our cattle are grown on. So maybe, but I would say that's more of a personal preference. But I personally do not see a health or ecological imperative to eat less beef. Yes, Lois.
Yes. So I go to Woodman's to buy their hamburger, which I don't eat a lot of, but I will pay the $7.99 a pound. And it seems to me that it says it is packaged by a Wisconsin farm. Can I trust that?
Okay, unfortunately, so you can trust where it's packaged. You can't trust where it's grown.
Okay.
Because also it is it's illegal to mandate where food is grown in terms of country. It is a WTO regulation that in terms of anti-competitiveness, that kind of thing, that we cannot mandate that food be labeled with what country it comes from in terms of meat. All right, we cannot mandate that. Some places can brag about it with their stickers. However, if something is grown outside the US, so say a beef is grown outside the US and then it's brought into the US in a large chunk of meat, and then you cut it down in a butcher shop in the US, you can then label it product of the USA. Once you take a knife to it in the US, it's now a product of the US, even though it lived all of its life in a different country.
So where do I buy the best hamburger?
Well, I would encourage you to do your research, and I would say, look at if it says it was grown in Wisconsin, then yes, it was grown in Wisconsin. The word grown or raised, those are the words to look for. Otherwise, I would encourage you to shop local. There's plenty of us around. Getting beef locally is a challenge. Getting pork locally is a little easier. There are plenty of beef producers, though. We have beef, and but even Wisconsin grain-fed beef is available. U.S. grain-fed beef, because we don't import much grain-fed beef. In terms of beef, there's very little imported. We are a net exporter of beef in this country. So I would say that but in terms of grass-fed, there are some branded programs like Strauss, Thousand Hills. Those are the ones that are coming to my immediate mind. Those are I know are in the US. Those are both Midwest brands. Strauss is based in Illinois, but they buy Wisconsin cattle. Thousand Hills is in Minnesota. They also buy Wisconsin cattle. So that's what I know of. I haven't been to a Woodman's lately to be able to tell you. I'm sorry. We don't.
Would the butchers there know where it came from?
They might. I don't know.
Okay.
So Metcalf's has beef, they say it's Piedmontese, which I think is grown in Colorado.
Nebraska.
Or Nebraska? No, I thought it was Colorado.
Well,
but,
Piedmontese is a breed.
Yes, right.
So, but, and I mean, they're beautiful cows, but I mean, if they say it's grown in Colorado, then it's grown in Colorado. I would trust that. Yeah.
But just Piedmontese doesn't tell us anything.
Right. Right.
I'll just ask, sorry, when I've been out to Colorado and I've seen these huge feedlots from the train, it just seems like they're not raised as sustainably as me in the US. I'm gonna go off mute because it's really
Wait,
annoying.
can you repeat the question?
Sorry. Just trying not to mute it.
So you see the feedlots.
Okay, see the feedlots, and it just looks terrible to me because it's just there's these open feedlots, there's thousands of cattle,
It smells to the
and I think I don't want to eat meat from that situation.
Okay, so then U.S. grain-fed beef is probably not for you. However, I will say that you're right. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's not how I choose to raise my animals. However, those animals they're outside. The beef is the only meat commodity in the US that is consistently raised outdoors for its entire life cycle. Okay. Dairy is indoors, pork is indoors, chicken is indoors. Beef is the only one that gets to breathe fresh air, even if it's poop smelling fresh air. Okay. Fresh air the whole time. I'm sorry, I'm a teacher. I use the word poop a lot. And that is a short amount of their lifespan that they're in those feedlots. The average grain-fed beef in the US goes to slaughter at about, I think it's down to 14 months these days. So 14, 15 in there. And they're only there for the last 45 to 60 days. They're with their mamas for the first 6 months. They are the only meat commodity in the United States that gets to spend their lives with their mamas. Because Dairy gets taken away at birth. Pigs get 3 weeks in a farrowing barn. And well, chickens are chickens. So yeah, beef spends unequivocally, beef across, with the exception of dairy beef, because it's a whole different story, but beef cattle in the United States spend 6 months on their mamas out on grass, running around, being cattle, playing games. Yeah. So if you choose not to support feedlot beef, I understand that. I will say that on the gradient of things, it's a whole heck of a lot better than a lot of the other options.
So you're saying that pork or pigs can be both inside and outside, or both, or however?
The vast, vast, vast majority of pork in the United States is indoors. My pigs are outside. That is a teeny tiny fraction of the pork industry. Okay, so most pigs are raised indoors in very sterile environments because pigs are, because they're so closely related to humans, they do share diseases with us, and so they spread disease. We can spread diseases with and between pigs very easily. So they put them in a shower, what we call shower in, shower out facilities, where you have to go through decontamination to be with the pigs. And so most pigs are raised indoors to protect them from disease. And because when you're raising large amounts of them, one of them gets sick, it just rips through the whole herd. And so there's that. And so there's facilities for farrowing, in which you have thousands of sows living together. And or there's gestation facilities where lots of sows are hanging out together. I've seen a barn with 5,000 sows hanging out. And then when they're ready to have babies, they move them down a hallway to a different facility, usually for farrowing. And that's where they have their babies, and they stay there for about 3 weeks. And then they get taken out so they can get pregnant again. All right. And then those babies after 3 weeks get put in a nursery facility. And then from nursery on up to grower and finisher. There's still a lot of hogs, a lot of sows that are being raised in gestation crates in which they have no freedom of movement. So hogs make me sad. Hogs make me sad. Not so much in the nursery grower finisher phase, because then they do like it's just pigs in a barn and they're running around together doing their thing. You know, they often provide like enrichment, like little balls to play with and stuff, because pigs are playful. But the farrowing industry is hard. I understand why they do it, because pigs are extremely dangerous. We risk our lives every time we deal with ourselves. Right now I'm looking at a long season of farrowing and a long season of how the heck do we do this without getting killed, because sows are very large and very dangerous and very protective of their babies. But yeah, pigs are, so unless you're buying pastured pork, pigs are inside.
Okay. Are the industries trying to get away or getting away from using antibiotics?
Yes, they are. I don't think we'll ever see a fully away from antibiotics, nor do I think we should, because I believe it's only humane that when an animal gets sick, you give it good medicine to treat the illness. I don't believe in denying best practice medicine, just as we wouldn't deny medicine of it to a human. But getting away from using antibiotics prophylactically and as growth promotants, we're seeing a lot less of that these days, and it's continuing to trend in that direction.
We have Bethany and Ike, I think, with us, and I wonder if they would like to say a few words. Bethany's family, I think, has been doing the regenerative agriculture for some time now. Are they still with us, and would they like to say hello?
Hi, Carolyn. Hi, everyone. I would just like to say thanks to Natasha for sharing your perspective and your vast knowledge with the group. So I know I learned a lot, even being raised in an agricultural family. So thanks so much for sharing. I'm not sure when we wanted to end up, but I did have one question for Natasha. Do we still have time for questions, or do you try and wrap up by 11:30?
Good.
Good. Natasha, I really appreciated all of the comments you made around justice within agriculture. So my question is, how can we bring farmers along in the social justice movement? And that could be a whole nother lecture, but maybe like, a few minutes of your thoughts would be great.
Of course, I love you, Bethany. How it's getting better, slightly. I'm seeing signs of light in that, I saw someone who knows, an agricultural person acknowledged that the protesters in Minneapolis had a cause. They didn't agree with the means, but they had a cause. That was a step in the right direction. And when I once mentioned working with the tribes in a meeting, people didn't shy away from the comments. So that's a step in the right direction. It's getting better. I think really having these conversations about making people aware of the history of discrimination from the top down level in agriculture is really important, I think, because, for example, shockingly few people know about the Pigford decisions, which, if you don't know what the Pigford decisions are, because it seems like I don't know why, but people don't know of them. Pigford decisions were two Supreme Court decisions, so U.S. SCOTUS decisions that ruled that the USDA had discriminated against farmers of color and women over the course of a century, and that they were has led to the USDA. When we talk about Black farmers losing their land, and so the statistic that gets thrown out is that Black farmers have lost 90% of the land they've owned in the last century or so. A large amount of that is due. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but a huge culprit is the USDA itself and the local land and the local agents who work at the Farm Service Agency office, because they are these offices out in these small communities. They're staffed by people who live there, and there's not a ton of oversight, and they're a loan agent, they're a financial officer that is able to give out loans to farmers to help them stay afloat. And well, when you put racist people on those positions, you're not going to get, and so it was proven in the Supreme Court multiple times now that the USDA discriminated against farmers of color. And there have been some reparations made to that effect. But the fact that it was proven, you can use that to say to people like, look, this is a fact. This isn't just like somebody feels aggrieved. This is a fact. It has been proven over and over again that the USDA is responsible for people of color losing their land because they denied them loans. And when you say that to people, that kind of wakes people up. Thank you, Nancy. So I think it's that's something that when I bring that up, people are like, oh. And otherwise, I just, we're making progress. you know, I'm a Farm Bureau member. I'm a proud Farm Bureau member, despite all of their issues. The great thing about them, they're a grassroots organization, and I really, really love the Wisconsin Farm Bureau, and I really love my county Farm Bureau. Iowa Farm Bureau, I'm laying no claims to them. They have problems beyond problems. But the president of American Farm Bureau, as much as he is a landed Georgia peanut farmer, he is an adorable man, and his heart is in, he has a really, really beautiful heart, and he has spoken truth on a lot of issues in the past year in ways I did not expect him to. And he's taken a lot of crap for it, excuse my language. And he has taken a lot of flack from the farming community, because like last June, he made a statement about racism, and they are starting to talk about racism in agriculture at the American Farm Bureau level, which I just never thought I would see. They're starting to talk about, they're using the words climate change now. They're advocating for carbon credits. So, I mean, they're still all about, you know, protecting themselves, but the fact that they're even going to say the words climate change is a huge step in the right direction. So I do think we're moving in the right way. It's gonna be slow because we're talking about people who have immense amounts of wealth and see it as being threatened. And they see the culture changing, they see their privilege changing, and that's hard for them, you know, and it's also a lack of exposure. So you know, and they don't exactly have churches that are preaching justice messages. There's a few, and I do notice that like the farmers that go to the ELCA and the UCC up here in my town, which are the two most liberal churches around, they have a different perspective because they're hearing that message in terms of their spirituality as well. And full disclosure, I'm a Baha'i. I'm not even Christian, but I'm a huge fan of the ELCA and the UCC. If I was a Christian, I'd be one of the two. So, you should say hello to the Baha'is sometime. They have a center down on Lakeside Street on the east side. So, but yeah, so that's, I guess, Bethany, I don't have a great answer, but that's where I'm at. I also just supporting, if you have the opportunity to, with your dollars or with your voices, supporting BIPOC farmers, really, really huge. We'll get there. We'll get there someday.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Zoom claps, Zoom claps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natasha. Look forward to seeing you at the farmer's market one of these weeks.
Yeah.